Hey, NAMI students, Mr. Yance here. Starting with a new chapter in the new trimester. So this is uh, basically the brain part one. So what I'm going to do is try to break the brain chapter down, the central nervous system down into two parts. Mainly, I'm going to go over all of the central nervous system, a little overview, and then kind of focus on the cerebrum, which is the huge, large part of the central nervous system where we do our, all of our problem solving and emotions and thought processes and memories and all that stuff. So to start out with, let's just talk about some introductory stuff. The meninges, which are membranes around the brain and the spinal cord, the spinal cord itself, and then obviously the brain is part of that CNS too. And there's my joke for the day. So let's start with meninges. The meninges are basically membranes. You may have heard of something called meningitis, where these get swollen and can cause some very life-threatening situations, especially if it's bacterial. There's bacterial and virus meningitis, and that's why we call it meningitis. They're just membranes between bone and soft tissue, and basically we have three of them. And when we dissect the brain, whether if you're doing it in class or virtual, you'll see the dura mater. It's the outermost layer of the meninges. Looks like a tough white tarp, very strong fibrous tissue. The arachnoid is in between the layers. And you might say, why arachnoid? Doesn't that mean spider? It does, because it looks like a spider web. And there's no blood vessels in that. And then the pia mater, or mater, kind of weird wording, is the innermost membrane that contains nerves and blood vessels. So if you look at these layers, what you see is lots of protection. So we got the scalp, the skin, and then we have a little lining inside of the scalp called the periosteum. And then we have the bony skull or vertebrae. And then there's a dura mater, and then there's a space, and then there's arachnoid, and then there's a space, and then there's the pia mater, and we'll look at all those. So what's significant about these membranes is, number one, they protect, and number two, they allow for passageways for something called cerebral spinal fluid to flow. So we have a constant circulating fluid, it's kind of a grayish fluid between the arachnoid and the pia maters membranes, and that's really important, and I'll explain that a little bit more later on as we get into notes. So that's what we call the CSF. The dura mater is basically, like I said, looks like a white piece of tarp. You can see it there on the picture. It basically takes think of your brain as a bowl of Jello. It's 80% water. It shakes, causes concussions sometimes. So we have this wrap around it, and that kind of helps keep it intact so it doesn't move as much. So it's a really good protective layer between the skull and that soft tissue. The problem we have sometimes is with something called subdural hematoma, which is a fancy word for blood gathering or pooling. That's due to a blow to the head or traumatic brain injury. It gathers there in between the dura mater and the brain. And unfortunately, since we have a skull, it has no place to go. Think about jamming a finger or spraining an ankle or something like that. It can puff out and has a place to expand out. With the brain, everything goes in. My father had a very serious car accident, and he had such severe subdural hematoma. He was in a coma for like 6 days. They had to take his skull off. They literally took his temporal and parietal parts of his skull and had to take it off so that could come out, because it was causing so many issues with brain function. Okay. This video is available. I'll see if I can get another one, but there's some good videos about that. Not for the squeamish. If blood bothers you, although there's not a lot of blood with brain surgery, you may not want to watch these, so I'm not going to show them here. But there's some good videos that show that if you want to watch them. Okay. The spinal cord, I just kind of want to touch upon it real quick. We have, if you remember back in the bone chapter, skeletal chapter, we had, the vertebrae. We had 7, 12, and 5, if you remember, vertebrae. There's 31 segments, and each one of them has a pair of spinal nerves. I'll kind of show you that in a minute. The cervical enlargements up by your neck, that supplies your upper limbs with nerves. The lumbar supplies the lower part of your body with impulses. And the thing you have to understand with spinal nerves and spinal cords is we have ascending and descending. Ascending means these are impulses that travel to the brain. So I pick up an object and it's hot or cold. That is an ascending impulse that travels from my fingers to my brain, and I interpret what that is. Descending impulses travel back and allow us to move muscles and to react to things. And think about that, takes a little time. If you ever watch slow motion video, I like to watch slow-mo guys. And we think we pick up a hot object and boom, it's immediately that we release it. But if you slow that footage down, you see there's a slight, it's microseconds, but there's a slight delay from the time I pick something up. So it's an ascending nerve impulse, and the brain has to say, oh my lands, this is hot. This is going to harm your fingers. Release it. It feels like it's instantaneous. But if you slow it down, it does take time for these to work back and forth. All right. And these nerves are just numbered. We have C1 through 8. We got one above and one below. So I know we have 7 cervical vertebrae, but you can see there's one above the C1 and one below the C1. Then we have the thoracics. There's 12 of those because there's 12 thoracic vertebrae and 5 lumbar. You may have to write this in your notes because I think the notes I gave you was missing 4 and 5, but I was adding these up there today. I'm like, wait a minute, those don't add up to 31. There's 5 sacral that go through your sacrum. And then there's a tailbone one called the coccygeal. If you've ever felt on your tailbone, you know where that nerve is. So these are just communications. So our brain has to be able to communicate to our muscles, and we also have to be able to communicate back with the sensations. All right. So I think that's really, really important that we understand there's a two-way path that nerves follow. All right. Now, to start in with the brain, that's the spinal cord. The brain, real quick here, is one of the largest adult organs. It weighs about 3 pounds. There's 100 billion nerves, which we call neurons, and 900 billion neuroglia, which are branches. I'll show you that in the next video. To say that we'll fill our brain up if we live to be 90 or 100 years old is not true. We have so many pathways. They say there's more pathways for us to remember things in our brain than there's stars in the universe. That's hard to fathom, but think about that. And there's this unlimited number of these. In most adults, it weighs about that 3 pounds, as I said before. Generally smaller in women than men because their bone structure and their skeleton is a little smaller. It does not mean, guys, do not think this way or you'll get in big trouble. It does not make men smarter than women. Brain capacity has nothing to do with intelligence. Same way with this. Older people, it's a little smaller than younger people, so don't go home telling your parents you're smarter than they are. They have more life experiences. You're not smarter than they are. So understand that there is some differences in brains, in male, female, older, younger. Here's a big thing. You probably remember this from Bio 1. In the brain, the problem is we only go through mitosis in the brain when we're developing as an embryo, those 9 months inside of mom. In the first few months of the postnatal years after that, our brain only grows in bulkiness, mass, not number, size, not number. And here's what's crazy. When a lady gets pregnant, one of the first things a gynecologist or a doctor will do is put that woman on a vitamin regimen and talk about the foods that they eat and avoiding alcohol and smoking and things like that. Because look at this. This is an insane thing. Malnutrition can result in fewer brain cells in that baby. So you are lowering the potential of that child of having as many brain cells as possible. And since we lose them from a few months after we're born until we die, that's important we get as many as we can. Your brain attains its full size by 18. It grows most rapidly during the first 9. So most of you are probably about done with your brain growing. Okay, and think about that other statement up there. The brain grows most rapidly. So true. If you've ever been around, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, that age bracket, they always ask why, and they drive you crazy, and they have so much energy. But there is some truth about all we need to know for later in life. We learn in kindergarten. There's some truth to that because our brain's a sponge because it's growing the most rapidly during those first 9 years. And we do learn a lot of things that we need for later in life. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. As always, if you have questions, let me know. Shoot me an email, and that type of thing.